Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Peter and Herod in Acts chapter 12. Back in Acts chapter 10, we saw Cornelius, the Roman centurion who meets Peter and invites him to be his guest in his home, eats a meal with him. Now, as we come to chapter 12, our story opens with Herod Agrippa, the king of Israel, who arrests Peter and condemns him to death. That's quite a contrast, and I suspect we're meant to see these two stories in contrast with one another. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now, about this time, Herod the king, and we have to pause and speak a bit about this Herod the king who lays hands on some who belong to the church in order to mistreat them. We'll look at the rest of the verse in a moment. But our first question begins with, who on earth is Herod the king? You see, when we speak of Herod, you normally think of Herod the Great. He had been king of Israel back in the days when Jesus was born. You remember how it had been him who had brought about the slaughter of infants. Well, he's long since been dead, and I have here some of his children and grandchildren. Let me just go from left to right. On the left, you see his wife Mariamne the First. He actually has another wife named Mariamne the Second. Mariamne the First had Alexander and Aristobulus, but there had been plots against Herod's life to try to kill him and put one of his two sons by her on the throne. The reason for this was because she was the last surviving daughter of the Maccabees, of the Hasmoneans. And Herod had both those sons put to death. He had them killed. However, some of their children had survived, including, notice down at the bottom, Aristobulus, Agrippa the First. He's going to be Herod Agrippa, the one we're speaking of in just a moment, and also Herodias. But let me just finish up. He had two other sons through Malthach, and that was Archelaus. Archelaus actually became his successor when Herod died, and a younger son by the name of Herod Antipas. They all referred to themselves as Herod because, after all, Herod had been their father. Herod Antipas, who became the tetrarch of Galilee. And you remember back in the Gospel of Luke, Herod Antipas had taken his brother's wife, Herodias. What happened is Antipas went to visit his half-brother Philip and met his wife Herodias, and they fell in love, and they ran off together, and so she divorced Philip, and she now married Antipas. Remember how John the Baptist says you shouldn't take your brother's wife? That's against the Mosaic law. And so there had been a big scandal about that. Now, notice that Agrippa was the brother, and he was actually the younger brother. I think he was younger, maybe not, than Herodias. But Herodias has now married Antipas, and when Agrippa was quite young, I'm going to look at his background in a minute, but one of the things that he did, he spent some time with Uncle Antipas, actually in his palace, and the two did not get along. It was sort of a nasty relationship. He did love his sister, but not so much the man she had chosen for her new husband. All right, let's look a bit at this Herod Agrippa. His father had been executed, one of those sons of Mariamne who had been executed by Herod the Great just a few years before his death in the year 7 BC. He had been educated in Rome, so brought up as a good Roman, and then, as I just said, lived for a time in residence in the city of Tiberias there on the Sea of Galilee with his uncle Antipas, and they did not get along at all. They never did get along. He eventually returned to Rome, and here he cultivated a friendship with a young heir to the emperor by the name of Caligula. Caligula was not the emperor yet, and indeed, the story goes that one day he and Caligula were out riding their horses and just having sort of a good old time, and he turned and remarked, if your uncle Tiberius would just die, then you would be a great emperor. And apparently, this conversation made it back to Tiberius, and Agrippa was thrown into prison, and he was chained and thrown into prison, and there he sat for a number of months until Tiberius died. As soon as Tiberius died, Caligula now became the new emperor, and the first thing that he did, he said, "Go release my friend Herod Agrippa, take the chains off him, weigh the weight of those chains, and give him the amount of gold equal to that weight." So Agrippa went from prison to palace all in one move, and now Caligula sent him back to Israel and made him king of the Jews, so that he was given, first of all, the tetrarchy of Philip, and then actually a day came where Agrippa went to Rome and accused his uncle Antipas of fermenting a rebellion. I don't know that he was actually going to do that, but apparently Antipas had collected some weapons and an armory, something he wasn't actually supposed to do, and Antipas was recalled to Rome and questioned about it, and he admitted that he did have the armory, that he did have these weapons stored up. And so as a result, he was banished. Remember Herodias, that had been the sister of Agrippa? She didn't have to, but she went into banishment with Antipas. And this left Herod Agrippa as ruler now he was given Galilee, but also Samaria and Judea. So he has this entire region now becomes under his sway, and he is given the title of a king. Antipas had wanted to be a king, but was never given that title. Herod Agrippa is given that title. Now, a bit later, there's a temple incident, and what happens is Caligula was not a particularly good Roman emperor. He was considered to be just a bit crazy. And one of the things that he does, he hears that those Jewish people there in Jerusalem have a temple, and there's no idol within the temple. And he said, well, that's too bad. They really need an idol for their temple. I know. Go in there and make a statue of myself and put it in the temple. He actually issued orders that take place. Now, the orders were on their way to the governor of Syria, who's supposed to come down and do that. And meanwhile, Agrippa hurried to Rome and said, "Please, please don't do that. We'll say prayers on your behalf, but we don't have idols in our temple. That's actually against our law." And he talked him down from that. And so Caligula changed his mind. He did actually order the governor of Syria to be executed for not having immediately carried that out. He delayed. He procrastinated a bit. And even that order wasn't carried out because Caligula was assassinated shortly after that. Well, our story picks up now. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. The Greek term kakosai, the aorist infinitive of kakoo. It really has the idea, because mistreat doesn't sound all that bad. It's to treat them badly, and I guess that's mistreating. But I think the idea here is a bit stronger, as we will see in the next verse. Verse 2, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Now we have a number of people by the name of James here in the New Testament. And actually the way you say James is an anglicized version of it. When you read it in the Greek text, it's Jacobos, or we would just say Jacob. They didn't actually have the letter J in either Greek or Hebrew. So that's always sort of an anglicized, an English version of saying that name. So there were actually two apostles by the name of James. There was James, the brother of John, but there was also James, the son of Alphaeus, because it was a very common name. And there's also James, the half-brother of Jesus. So those two, as far as we can tell, were still alive and would continue to be, at least for a time. In fact, we're going to see James, I think it's the half-brother of Jesus, when we get to Acts chapter 15. So don't let that, you have one James killed here, but there are other James in the New Testament and in the church and in Jerusalem that were still alive. So don't let that throw you off. Verse 3, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, that is, putting James to death, did that, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And then we're told now it was during the days of unleavened bread. And you have to catch the setting. We're going to come back and connect this all with that specific period. But the days of unleavened bread that was the first feast in the entire calendar of the Jewish year, which always began in the spring. On the 14th of Nisan, you would have the Passover, and that kicked off this entire feast. So when you see the days of unleavened bread, that begins with the Passover, and you need to remember that because I think it's going to be somewhat significant to our story. Indeed, remember, this was the same time of the year in which Jesus had been executed. So Jesus had been executed at the Passover. The cross took place on the Passover. And here during the days of unleavened bread, that same time of the year, James has been killed and now Peter is arrested. Verse 4, and when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after, and notice the Passover is mentioned, after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. So the people are happy over the death of one of the New Testament believers. Herod Agrippa is satisfying them. He's happy that he's making them happy. And the church is in prayer for Peter's deliverance. Verse 6, on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward. So presumably the Passover is finished. Maybe this entire week of unleavened bread is finished. I'm not quite sure about that. But it's that time of the year. And Peter, I have to laugh, Peter was sleeping between the 2 soldiers. You sort of get the sense that Peter maybe isn't quite as worried as he should be. If you knew it was your last night, that you're being executed the next morning, maybe that issue would keep you up at night. But I don't see that. Now, maybe it's just because he couldn't help it. He fell asleep. Maybe he had been worrying. I don't know what's in his heart. But notice how secure he is. He's sleeping between 2 soldiers bound with 2 chains. And there's guards in the front of the door who are watching over the prison. There looks like no possible way he can escape because, why such great care? Because there's been times already that we've seen Peter imprisoned and supernaturally released, and now they're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. So he's between 2 soldiers bound with 2 chains. There's guards in the front. There's people watching over the prison. It looks completely hopeless. Verse 7, and behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And the reason the light shows in the cell is because usually they keep those places dark. They don't have electric lighting and so on. And he struck Peter's side, and we're going to see the significance of that in a bit, and woke him up, which tells me not only is he asleep, he is asleep soundly. Peter, get up! In fact, he says, get up quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, gird yourself and put on your sandals. And he did so. Now, notice the steps here. Gird yourself, put on your sandals, and wrap your cloak around you, and follow me. So here he hadn't been ready. Get ready, get all these things in place. And he's doing this. The chains have fallen off, but there's 2 guards. There's soldiers out front. Verse 9, and he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. You see, he's going through all these things, but it just seems a little surreal, like it isn't really taking place. Now, I have a confession to make, a little excursus. One of the things I do when I go to sleep, and especially if I can't sleep, sometimes I will take sort of an iPod and put the buds in my ear. I'm told this might not be really good for me, but I try to turn the volume down, and sometimes I'll fall asleep listening to something like a lecture, not my pastor's sermons, but some sort of lecture. And sometimes it'll be just a nice way to spend some time, but sometimes I'll actually fall asleep doing it. Not too long ago, I had the experience where I had fallen asleep, and he's with the Lord now, so I can say I was listening to an old lecture by R.C. Sproul. If you haven't heard him, he's well worth listening to, but in this case, I fell asleep during the lecture. And I began to dream. And in the dream, I could, in fact, in the dream, I actually had this earbud on and was listening to the lecture, and somebody came and wanted to talk to me, and I went to turn it off, and it wouldn't shut off. And I pushed it, and I took the earbud out, and nothing happened. And I said to myself in the dream, I said, "Oh, I'm dreaming. I'm asleep. I'm going to have to wake myself up in order to turn this off." And I actually thought, now how do I do that? In the dream, I actually yelled at myself. I didn't do it out loud, but in the dream, I yelled at myself, "Wake up!" And it didn't happen. And eventually, the dream ended, and I woke up and turned it off. And it was sort of a funny sort of situation, a little surreal. Well, here, Peter thinks that that sort of thing is happening. He thinks that this is a vision or a dream, but not something entirely real. But the truth of the matter, it is real. And so in verse 10, when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate which leads into the city. You see, there's all of these guards that have been in the way. And then finally, there's a gate which opened for them by itself, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So notice they go past the first guard, the second guard, the gate, and they come out into the city. And they've passed all these barriers. Verse 11, when Peter came to himself. Now, he hasn't really woken up because he's already been awake, but he hasn't realized he's been awake. He said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people, all that the Jewish people were expecting. He has been released from the sentence of death." And there's a wonderful parallel here. Remember, this was the time of the Passover. And because the passage has told us that, I think we're supposed to see the story in light of the Passover. Because in the Passover, the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt, and here Peter had been held a prisoner in Herod Agrippa's prison. In the Passover, every firstborn of Egypt had been condemned to death. And Peter, likewise, has been condemned to death. In the Passover, the angel of death, remember, passed over those houses which had a lamb's blood applied. That was the only way they could be saved. And here in Peter's release, an angel comes and doesn't pass over, but an angel releases Peter and guides him to the home of a Jewish woman. We're going to see that next. In the Passover, the Jews were not to eat the Passover girded. They were to eat the Passover. They were to be dressed and ready and wearing their sandals and to eat it in haste. It wasn't a casual meal. It was a meal that they were to eat as they were getting ready to leave Egypt. And in the Passover memorial, supposed to be done every year since, they would typically do the same thing. They would act out as if they're ready to go somewhere, as if they're ready to leave Egypt, and they would act that out in the ensuing Passover celebrations. Likewise, in Peter's release, he is told, gird yourself, put on your sandals, make haste. He hadn't really gotten ready for the Passover, but he's to get himself ready, and those elements are repeated. In the first Passover, you'll remember once they left Egypt, the sea opened to allow the Israelites to escape, and they passed through the waters of the Red Sea. In Peter's release, the iron gate from the prison opened of its own accord to allow Peter to escape. In the Passover, the armies of the Pharaoh, remember how they tried to follow? They were drowned in the sea, and we haven't seen it yet. But we're going to see that after Peter's release, the soldiers of Agrippa, who were deemed responsible for his escape, we're going to see that they're executed. They die as well. Verse 12, and when he realized this, he realizes it hasn't been a dream, this was real, he went now to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. So we've got this individual, John, Mark, he goes by both names. We're going to see both names mentioned. I suspect this is the same Mark who gives us the gospel according to Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And remember, they're still praying for the release of Peter, which has taken place, but they're not aware that it has taken place. So in verse 13, when he knocked at the door of the gate, this was apparently a large enough home to hold an accommodated gathering. The church, such as it was in that day, had gathered, at least a number of members had gathered in the home. And so you would have not only the door to the house, but maybe a gate that surrounds the area. And so he knocked at the door of the gate. A servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate. She forgot to open him. She forgot to let him in. She hears this, Peter! And instead of letting him in, ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. Well, they said to her, you're out of your mind. Shh, we're praying for Peter's release. But Peter's out there. No. We're praying for Peter's release. But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, it is his angel. Now, they don't really think that this is like a supernatural angel, I don't think. And the reason I say that is because the Greek there, ha angelos estin auto, the word angelos, yes, we can translate that angel, but it would be the same translation if we translated that it is a messenger from him. And so I suspect that they were thinking it's not a supernatural angel, but that rather a messenger had come bringing news from Peter to them, maybe sort of a last will and testament or a request to keep on praying. So they're thinking that it's something very natural, and meanwhile, something supernatural has taken place. And all the while, Peter's still outside and he's still knocking. And so, verse 16, but Peter continued knocking. And when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, and the reason he has to do it with his hand and not just with his voice, is because they're all talking. A sudden bedlam has ensued. But motioning them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of prison. And he said, report these things to James. Now you say, wait a minute, not James that had died, but I suspect James, the Lord's brother, could have, I suppose, been the other James the Apostle. But the fact that he's mentioned by name, I think maybe is focused upon James, the brother of the Lord, who's also going to rise up and be a leader within the church, and is already that, evidently. And the brethren. Then he left and went to another place. After all, he still has a sentence of death under himself. So he's not going to stay there. He's going to go into a hiding into another unreported location. And so we'll say goodbye to James, but we'll see him eventually. Now, here I'm borrowing this chart from Craig Keener's book, his commentary on the book of Acts. It's a four-part commentary, excellent commentary if you've never seen that. Came out over a series of years. And we already noted that Luke, not just the Passover back in the book of Exodus, but the cross event. And what Keener does, he compares and contrasts the cross event with Jesus in Luke chapter 2, verse through 24, which also took place at a Passover. Notice we have two Passover stories. Jesus was crucified at the Passover, but here Peter had been captured and imprisoned and released at the time of Passover. Back in Luke chapter 22 through 24, we had Herod Antipas. Of course, Pilate was there, but we're looking at Herod's. And so this is Herod Agrippa, not Antipas. Back then, Jesus had been arrested and put to death. Now we've seen Peter arrested and condemned to death. Back in the Luke account, the angels had announced the resurrection of Jesus to the women after the death, burial, and resurrection. This time we see an angel releasing Peter and guiding him to the home of a woman. So there's women involved in both stories. Back in Luke's account, the women are initially not believed. Remember, when they see the empty tomb and they report, and the disciples initially do not believe them. They're not sure what to make of it. And here we see Rhoda is not initially believed. So both have stories in which a woman reports something and is met with disbelief on the part of those who hear. In Luke's account, the disciples, when they first see Jesus, they think it is a spirit or a ghost or something. They don't really believe that he's risen from the dead. And in Acts 12, the disciples think that Peter is a messenger, an angelos. I don't think they're thinking it's a supernatural being, but a messenger. They think he's something else that's taken place. Verse 18, now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. After all, they wake up and the chains are there and the guards are there and the door is there, but no Peter. Verse 19, when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away, and the idea here, to execution, where they suffer the same fate that would have gone to Peter. And then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. So we had Peter who came to Jerusalem, but now Herod goes down to Caesarea, and when we see him next, he will be there in Caesarea. That's actually the capital of the area, even though Herod Antipas had spent quite a bit of time here in Jerusalem. So we have James put to death, and then Peter delivered from a sentence of death. But next, we're going to see Herod Agrippa, who himself is going to die a painful death. So these are the three deaths that take place, or two deaths and one release from death, that take place here in Acts chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 20, therefore, now he, this is Herod Agrippa, was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are two Phoenician cities. As you go north along the coast from Israel, you get to these two cities, Tyre and Sidon. And with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, that is, you can't go straight to Herod Agrippa, but they had made an appointment with we would call him his Secretary of State, and they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. Now, remember, back in Acts chapter 11, we'd had a prophecy that a great famine would come over all the land, over all the earth. We could translate that land or earth, works either way. And evidently the famine had come, and now in the midst of this famine, this is leading to these Gentiles, these Phoenicians from Tyre and Sidon, coming to Herod Agrippa, and apparently they are seeking some sort of relief having to do with this famine, because their country was fed by the king's country, and because there's food to be had in Israel, and they're hoping to get some of that. Verse 21, on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, we're going to see in a minute, the New Testament doesn't tell us, but we're going to see that in Josephus' account, he's going to tell us a bit about this quote-unquote royal apparel. Having put on his royal apparel, took a seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them, and the people kept crying out, the voice of a god and not of a man. Notice these are pagans, and they're acting like pagans, and they're giving acclaim to Herod Agrippa. But notice what they're saying. They're saying the voice of a god and not of a man. Now, Josephus, tells the same story that we're reading here. In his book Antiquities, book 19, he says, on the second day of which shows, Herod had put on some shows, he put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner. In other words, it sort of glittered and sparkled, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. They didn't have electric lights. They didn't have these bright, shining things. They'd never seen anything like that. And so we read, and presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place and another from another, though not for his good, that he was a god. Now notice how both the story in Acts and the story in Josephus, although they each add a few other details, it's not where one's just copying the other, but they both make mention of how those who were present were declaring that Herod Agrippa was a god. He was allowing himself to receive these honors of divinity. Verse 23, and immediately, this is back to the book of Acts, and immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and was eaten by worms and died. This is a terrible death. Josephus tells the same story about how when he had been quite worn out from the pain, that he doubled over in pain, that he was eaten. Actually, Josephus says he was eaten by worms. Notice, worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, 5 days of agony, he departed this life being in the 54th year of his age. By the way, what that does, it gives us the exact date. Josephus tells us that this was the year 44 AD. And this is helping us. This is the first of a number of dates that we're going to have in the account of the book of Acts that are going to help us pinpoint these events to the very year. So we know what year this is taking place. Up to this point, we've seen the crucifixion of Jesus and the growth of the church and the Apostle Paul and Philip and all these things taking place. And we weren't sure how long was passing. Notice 44 AD, this was some, either maybe 11 to 13 years. We're not sure exactly when the crucifixion of Jesus took place, but somewhere between 11 to 13 years later, we are coming to this location. So that's how much time has passed from Acts chapter 1 up to Acts chapter 12. And so we have in this story where Agrippa kills James because it pleased the Jews. And then we had Agrippa accepting the acclamation of his divinity because it pleased the pagans. Now notice, pleasing the Jews to kill James, pleasing the pagans to say, yes, look at me, I'm a god. That's almost what he's doing. Would have not been pleasing to the Jews. What he's doing for the Jews, the pagans could have cared less about. They didn't know anything about James, putting them to death. And so we see Agrippa trying to please people, whether it's Jews or Gentiles, even doing things that at cross purposes would not have pleased the other party. But he shows himself, and it shows us the dangers of what can happen when you try to merely please people. And so another contrast from the hands of Keener, where he looks at Herod Agrippa, and Herod Agrippa subsequently leaves Jerusalem to go to Caesarea. We've already seen Peter leaving Caesarea to return to Jerusalem. In Agrippa's case, he claims the power of life and death over others. In Peter's case, he's condemned to death for preaching the message of life. In Herod Agrippa's case, he's angry with the Gentiles and refusing to share food with them in this time of famine. In Peter's case, remember how back in Acts chapter 10, he's gracious toward the Gentiles, even going in and eating with them, even though that was contrary to the custom of the Jews. In the case of Agrippa, he'd been acclaimed as a god. Remember how Peter had gone in to Cornelius, and when Cornelius went to bow down before him, Peter said, "No, no, I too am just a man. Don't try to bow down to me. I'm not a god. I'm just a man." What a study in contrast. In Agrippa's case, the Lord strikes Agrippa dead. In Peter's case, the angel strikes Peter awake. Remember how he came to wake him up and struck him on the side? He strikes Peter awake in order to free him. And it's a reminder of how Jesus suffered a blow, a spear thrust to the side, in order to pay for our sins, in order to deliver us from death into life, in order that he might free us from our imprisonment. Now, we're getting close to the end. I want to speak for a second about a reason to laugh, because I think this entire chapter, even though we saw the death of James, but that was only in the first verse, I think that it's meant to be seen as something of a comedy, that we are to laugh as we read of Peter's unlikely release. I think we're supposed to laugh at Rhoda's antics at the door, leaving Peter standing there as she goes to report. I think we're supposed to laugh at the Christians in their unbelief in the midst of their own prayer meeting as their answer is reported. And they say, no, no, it must just be a messenger from Peter. And I would suggest we're even to laugh at the helplessness and the ultimate demise of the enemies of the gospel. Because when we do that, we're echoing the laughter of God. It's a passage that we've already had quoted to us here in the book of Acts, where back in chapter 4, the church had prayed this prayer from Acts chapter 2. Remember, it started off, why do the pagans rage and the nations imagine a vain thing? Here in chapter 2, verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. And then saying that a different way, the Lord scoffs at them. And then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Jesus is reigning even now. We see that in the release of Peter. We see that in the death of Herod Agrippa. And we come to chapter 12 and verse 24, but the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. You see, all the arrests, even the martyrdom of James, it could not stop the growth of the church. And so, verse 25, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem. And when they had fulfilled their mission, remember their mission was to bring a relief fund, to bring famine funds. And so we had that story back at the end of chapter 11. And then we've read the story about moving against the church. And now as we come to the end, we're seeing Barnabas and Saul. They return to Antioch, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. But we'll see his story, the story of John Mark, and how he enters into the next section of the book of Acts. We'll see that as we come to the next chapter.